Conversations. This is our fourth and last conversation of this year's climate change series. So I invite you to go back and look at some of the others if you have not seen them. They are available on demand on our website. And I thank you for joining us for the closing session, which promises to be really fascinating. Professor Sito is a geographer and urban scientist, and she's one of the world's leading experts on contemporary urbanization and global environmental change. She uses a combination of satellite remote sensing, socioeconomic and biophysical data, field research, and modeling methods, and her research focuses on understanding how urbanization will affect the planet. Her work has generated new discoveries on the interaction between urbanization and food systems, the effect of urban expansion on biodiversity and cropland loss, urban energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, and how cities can mitigate climate change. She has extensive fieldwork experience in Asia, especially China and India. She co-chairs the Climate Security Roundtable established by the U.S. National Academies to help better understand and anticipate the ways that climate change affects U.S. national security interests. She also co-chairs the U.S. National Academy's Subcommittee on U.S.-China Scientific Engagement. She has been a coordinating lead author for 2 UN climate change reports, the IPCC 6th Assessment Report published in 2022, and the IPCC 5th Assessment Report was published in 2014. Professor Sito is the author of City Unseen, published by Yale University Press in 2018, and it uses satellite imagery from cities around the world to understand how the world shapes urban landscapes and how urban landscapes shape the world. She is an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering, and a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I have to thank you, Professor Sito, because as we can see from your bio, you are quite busy, and making time to be with us here today is really a treat for us. I want to remind everyone that our faculty do these presentations out of the generosity of their scholarship to share them with the broader Yale community. And in exchange for that, we always like to support their work and remind the university how important their work is to our world and our community. And so I want to highlight Professor Sito's book. I know you have a copy of it, Karen, right? Could you hold up the copy for us to look at? There are a few copies of this book left. You can order from Amazon. It's a beautiful coffee table book, and it's one of my favorite things really to look at these sort of images of cities and see really the lifeblood of the cities and all of the things that go into making them these densely populated areas visually. It's a really unique opportunity to learn more about your work through a beautiful book. So I'm going to post a link in the chat where people can purchase a copy. And I thank you for offering to give us signed book plates for anyone who wants to email in and say that they're interested in getting a signed copy of your book. So I will turn it over to you now, Karen, to get us started with the presentation.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you for co-hosting this with Scale of the Environment. And I'll just start off by saying it's so wonderful to see, well, virtually see friends from far and from the past and the current. When Lauren said that there would be friends and students, I said, really? So anyhow, it's very nice to see folks from California and other places logged on. What I thought I would do today is ask this question and answer this question: is it possible to limit global warming? And what I will do over the next 40 minutes or so is bring together some of the key findings from the most recent IPCC report that was published in just earlier this year. And I want to just highlight that the IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, is actually comprised of 6 individual reports. There's Working Group 1's report is focused on the physical science basis of climate change. The second report, or the Working Group 2 report, is focused on impacts and vulnerability. And the third report is focused on mitigation of climate change. And as Lauren mentioned, I've been a lead of 2 chapters on 2 of these UN reports. So these are the 3 main reports of the 6th assessment, but there are also 3 other reports as part of the 6th assessment. One of them is on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Another one was on climate change and land, and then a third was on climate change and oceans and the cryosphere. So I'm going to draw from the key findings from all 6 of these reports to talk about the state of the science and to answer the question, is it possible to limit global warming? So first of all, in terms of where are we? The key finding from Working Group 1 is that it's very clear that the changes in climate are widespread and they are intensifying and they're unprecedented. And in fact, if we look at what has been happening over the last 2,000 years, we can see that over the last just few decades, the Earth is warming at really this unprecedented rate. So here you can see, so here we have over the last 2,000 years, really this significant increase over the last couple of decades. So we're really having this significantly faster rate of warming. This is seen in a number of different, manifested in a number of different ways. We see that CO2 concentrations are the highest it's been in 2 million years. If we look at sea level rise, it's the fastest rate in at least 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice area, the total area of Arctic sea ice is at its lowest level in 1,000 years. And glaciers are retreating, they're melting and they're retreating. And they're retreating at an, again, unprecedented rate in the last 2,000 years. So here are 4 different signals that we have that climate change is real, it's widespread, it's rapid, and again, this unprecedented nature. What does this mean? What are the impacts? Well, we're seeing more extreme heat, so more frequent heat waves. They're also more intense. We're seeing heavier bouts of rainfall. These heavier precipitation days, they last longer, they're more frequent, they're also more intense. We're seeing an increase in drought in some regions. Those of you from California and the West can attest to more fire. They're bigger, they're more frequent. And we're also seeing a really big signal in the ocean. The ocean is warming, it's losing oxygen. The oceans are acidifying. We're seeing the deaths of our coral reefs, big changes in sea life altogether. So there's a very clear signal that climate change is intensifying and the impacts are intensifying. So that's very clear. What I want to spend the bulk of this presentation doing is lay out some of the key findings from the Working Group 3 report and show where we are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, where we're heading, and really critically, what action we can take, what action we must take to limit global warming. So the first point that I want to make is that the reality is that greenhouse gas emissions are at their highest levels in human history. So if we look at emissions in 2019, they were about 12% higher than they were in 2010, and about 54% higher than they were in 1990. So the average annual rate of growth in global emissions, on the one hand, it slowed a little bit. It slowed to about 1.3% a year between 2010 and 2019, but it's still at its highest level ever. And the key message here is that we are not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. Now, I think one thing that's really important to point out that, in my opinion, hasn't gotten a lot of press or sufficient attention is that global warming has already reached about 1 degree C above pre-industrial levels. So what we mean by that is since the Industrial Revolution, the Earth has already warmed about 1 degree C. So we are already here. And if we look at the rate of global warming is increasing at a rate of about 0.2 degrees C every 10 years. And so if nothing changes, warming is expected to reach about 1.5 degrees C around 2040. So in less than 20 years, we're reaching a global warming of about 1.5 degrees C, again, above pre-industrial levels. Well, I think it's important to point out that there are two key conceptual pathways by which we can think about limiting climate change, whether to 1.5 degrees C or some other temperature range. One pathway you can see here on the left is if temperatures stabilize at or below 1.5 degrees C. That is, we approach 1.5 degrees C, but we don't go past 1.5 degrees C. The other pathway is we go beyond, temperatures rise, they exceed 1.5 degrees C. We don't know for how long before declining. And it's very likely that we're more likely to be in this scenario than this scenario on the left. So it's very likely that we will have some kind of overshoot. And so I did want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what are the potential impacts of overshooting 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C before we can bring temperatures back down and stabilize them. So I have a couple of examples. So if we overshoot 1.5 degrees C, we see that there'll be pretty significant impacts on coastal settlements globally, but especially in Asia, because the population in Asia are a lot of them are on the coast, and small island developing states, so small island nations, are also significantly at risk. We're looking at somewhere around 31 to 69 million people at risk to storm surges and sea level rise if we go over 1.5 degrees C. If we look at health issues, we're expecting to see about 350 million people or more being exposed to deadly heat waves. A lot of these will take place in megacities, but I want to highlight that it's not just in megacities. We're expecting about 35-ish million people to be affected by significantly reduced yields. Almost 500 million people will be living in places that are stressed by water. And then there will be significant impacts on ecosystems and the risk of actually catastrophic loss of ecosystems, especially coral reefs. If we look at a 2 degrees C world, if we overshoot 2 degrees C, where I want to highlight a couple of big differences. Coastal settlements still about the same, but here, one of the big things that the reports have highlighted is if we reach 2 degrees C, one of the big threats to health is shifts in and the expansion of the geographic range of vector-borne diseases. That is, if we reach a 2 degree world, it's very likely that there will be new novel vector-borne diseases in new places all around the world. And then I want to highlight this number, a significantly tenfold increase in those that'll be affected by reduced yields. Now we're looking at maybe up to about 400 million people being affected by reduced yields. So there's a pretty big difference between a world of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. The other key point that the report highlights is that if we reach this overshoot, so if we overshoot 1.5 degrees C before bringing temperatures down, it could push a number of systems, human systems and natural systems, beyond what scientists are calling limits of adaptation. And I think one really important thing here is that it's going to push these systems into places that we have actually very little scientific knowledge about. There's big gaps in knowledge about how ecosystems and human systems could adapt to a world of 2 degrees C. And we really lack governance and institutional experience to deal with civil society and health and issues around governance if we reach 2 degrees C. So it's clear that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C will be beyond reach. And for many of us, we are talking about a world of closer to a 2-degree world. So I did want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what would be necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. So generally, in the scenarios that were assessed by the IPCC, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C would require a couple of things. First, it would require greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2023. And for greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced by 43% by 2030. And that's compared to the 2010 numbers. So we would have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% in less than 10 years. Methane would have to be reduced by about a third. And really importantly is that CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero by around 2050. And so when we talk about net zero, what we're talking about is that the anthropogenic CO2 emissions, so human produced CO2 emissions, are balanced globally by what's taken in. And so basically we have about less than 40 years to reach net zero. If we were to limit warming to 2 degrees, greenhouse gas emissions would still need to peak by 2025. We have a little bit longer time in terms of reaching net zero. So CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero by around 2070. Again, this is balancing what anthropogenic emissions are compared to CO2 emission, CO2 removals by anthropogenic actions. So it's like balancing a checkbook, right? How much are you emitting versus how much are you removing from the atmosphere? So the big question is, can we make the transition to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C? And the good news is, yes, we can. So there's a lot of positive news here. Yes, we can. I do want to say we can do this, but it's going to take a lot of work. And maybe, as my colleague Aramar Revi likes to say, maybe just by the skin of our teeth. I want to, before I talk about the specific examples of what we have to do, I did want to give a little example of I would say like a glimmer of hope, many glimmers of hope from my experience with the IPCC. This is a picture taken from the 2014 IPCC approval plenary. So this is what happens. We finish writing the report and government representatives, we meet, this is pre-COVID, obviously. We meet over the course of a week. This was in Berlin from the 7th to the 12th. And we approve the summary for policymakers line by line. Literally, we go through line by line. So here I am sitting here with my other co-lead. Here's the chapter or the section, the summary for policymakers that I led. And we go through line by line. And the country delegates, they raise their flags. They can raise any questions that they have on the report, on the summary for policymakers. And for those of you who are graduate students or academics on the call, I mean, this is like the worst peer review process you can imagine. So they can ask you any question about your chapter, your assessment. And I would say that the tenor of the questions in 2014 were generally very different from the questions today or earlier this year. So here's the approval process from earlier this year. Here I am on the Zoom screen. Here's the section of the SPM that I led. And instead of raising their placards, the country delegates are raising their hands, just like in a regular Zoom room. As I said, the tenor of the questions are really different this time. 8 years later, compare 2022 approval to 2014 approval, my sense was there was a real recognition that there is an urgency and that we can do it, but that there are some major gaps around finance, major gaps around governance, major gaps around leapfrog technology. That was a very different conversation in 2014. 2014, it seemed like the questions were around, can we actually do it? What's the technology? Is this really possible? Whereas many of the questions this time were focused on, how can we accelerate? How can the Global South accelerate? So I see this as a lot of hope that countries are serious and that they really want to be able to accelerate change. So how are we going to do this? So we need to do two things. We need to upscale the things that we're doing. We need to do it at scale. And we simultaneously need to accelerate the implementation of many different mitigation strategies. So it's not enough just to have a boutique effort here or there. We really need to accelerate these ambitions and upscale them. Now, one of the key points of this report, the sixth assessment report, is that if we are to reach 1.5 degrees C or limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C, it will require massive transitions. And the report talks about major systems transitions in 4 different systems: in the energy system, industrial systems, land and ecosystems, and then also urban and infrastructure. So I'll talk about these just very briefly. So the energy sector accounts for about 1/3 of all emissions. And in order to limit global warming, it's going to involve a substantial reduction in fossil fuel use, low to no carbon energy systems, widespread electrification, use of alternative fuels such as hydrogen and sustainable biofuels, as well as use of carbon capture and significant improvements in energy efficiency. Now, transitioning to a low carbon energy sector is also expected to cut down international trade in fossil fuels. And the other thing that we have found in the report is that energy efficiency and reductions in energy consumption can also be achieved by using digital technologies. And in this way, it's possible to decentralize the energy network so that power comes from multiple localized energy networks rather than one main electricity grid. So it seems that electricity systems powered by renewables are increasingly viable, but it will be challenging to supply the entire energy system in this way. But if we look at renewables for a moment, in terms of, if we look at the cost of renewables, some forms of renewable energy and batteries have fallen significantly. So for example, if we look at photovoltaics, solar power, batteries, there's been a significant decline in the cost of all 3 of these. And at the same time, we've seen large increases in capacity that's being installed, as this figure shows. And already in a number of countries, electricity systems are already predominantly being powered by renewables. This is all good news. But again, we need to accelerate this. We need to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy and electrification of energy systems. In terms of industrial or transformation of the industrial system, reducing emissions in industry will have to involve using materials and energy much, much more efficiently. It will also require reusing and recycling products and also significantly minimizing waste. Now, these approaches are currently really underused. I really want to emphasize that. They're underused in policies, they're underused in industrial practice, but the science is clear that industries can be more efficient. They can recycle, they can reuse a lot of their materials. So for example, for basic materials, including steel and building materials and chemicals, there are low to net zero greenhouse gas production processes that are at their pilot to near commercial stage. And in some cases, they are at commercial stage, but they're not established in industrial practice. So part of this is closing this valley of death. There's research that's being done in universities, in the private sector, but they just haven't been adopted at scale. The industrial sector accounts for about a quarter of global emissions, and achieving net zero will be very challenging in this sector. It will require new production processes, low and zero emissions electricity, hydrogen, and again, where is necessary, carbon capture and storage. But again, I want to emphasize that a lot of the science is there. It's a matter of upscaling and accelerating the implementation. Now, to counterbalance these hard to eliminate emissions, such as from industry, it's going to require carbon dioxide removal. So carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, this refers to the process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. There are a number of CDR techniques that are out there. Each of them have different potentials for achieving negative emissions, as well as different associated costs and benefits and trade-offs. Some of these methods, they remove CO2 from the atmosphere, they store it on the ground, they store it underground, or they store it in the oceans. So some of the biological methods, some of them are being tested here at Yale. They store carbon, such as through reforestation and through the management of soil carbon. Some of these are widely practiced, like reforestation and soil carbon management. But there are also a number of new technologies, such as direct air capture and storage. That requires much more research. It also requires upfront investment. Also proof of concept at larger scales. And I would say much better understanding of what the trade-offs are in adopting these. But it's really clear from the report and from the assessment that CDR is essential to achieving net zero. I do want to underscore that if CDR is to work, and if it's going to work effectively, we also need agreed upon methods that in order to measure, report, and verify that these methods are working. In the land use sector, land use, forestry, agriculture, other land uses can provide large-scale emissions reduction and also remove and store carbon. This can be done a number of different ways. I don't want to say the easiest way, but one way they can do this is by protecting and restoring natural ecosystems, including forests, peatlands, coastal wetlands, savannas, grasslands. Improved and sustainable crop and livestock management can also play a really important part in land use, again, removing and storing carbon at scale. But land provides us with so much, for example, with food, with nature, and our livelihoods, our ability to feed animals. And so there are a lot of competing uses for land, and these really have to be carefully managed. I want to underscore that land can only do so much in terms of removing and storing carbon, and it cannot compensate for delayed emissions reductions in other sectors, such as reducing emissions from energy sector or from the industrial sector, as I just showed. Now that we're talking about land, I want to transition a little bit to talking about urban and infrastructure, cities. Cities also take up land. In the most recent report, we found that cities and urban areas generate around 2/3 of carbon emissions. Now, in 2/3 of carbon emissions, but you can see here in the graph, this is cumulative urban population in the X, and here in the Y, this is urban per capita emissions. There's a really big range in per capita emissions, urban emissions. Developed countries generate significantly more urban per capita emissions, but there are many more urban dwellers in Asia, in developing Pacific, and a growing urban population in Africa. So cities and other urban areas right now account for more than 2/3 of emissions. If we take into consideration what's produced in cities and then also what's brought in from elsewhere to operate and power cities, and it is really here where there's a significant potential for emissions reductions. And the key here is better spatial planning, better planning of cities, because one of the things that we learned in the assessment and also in the literature is that the way in which cities are laid out, where people live versus where they live, all of these are significant in affecting urban emissions. So some of the key strategies for lowering urban emissions would be to strategically densify cities. And here I really want to highlight strategically densify, and not just randomly densify, I mean, strategically densify, but also we need to strategically co-locate housing and jobs, putting people closer to where they can work. So those of you familiar with New Haven, my office is across from the Yale farm on Edward Street. I live exactly 1 mile from campus, and I'm able to walk to work or ride the bike or ride my bike or take the shuttle. So this co-location of housing and jobs can foster and enable walking and more cycling. And at the same time, cities also need to also electrify their energy systems and significantly enhance carbon uptake and storage in cities through urban vegetation, urban trees, street trees. I want to also underscore that these 2/3 of global emissions that come from cities, those come from cities that have already been built. So the New Havens, the San Franciscos, the Merceds, the cities that have already been built. But what we're expecting to see in the next 20 to 30 years is rapidly growing cities, especially in the global South. Every 5 days, we are adding every 5 days, we're adding 1 million people into cities. 1 million people into cities somewhere on the planet. Every day, we are converting a land area equal to 20,000 American football fields into cities. Those are 20,000 American football fields that could be forests, they could be savannas, they could be sequestering and storing carbon, but they're being converted to cities. So there are different challenges for the cities that have already been developed, like New Haven, versus rapidly growing and new cities. The other big transformation that we need to make is changes to demand and services through changing our lifestyles and behavior. The report finds that changing our lifestyles and behavior can reduce global emissions by 40 to 70% by 2050. Some of this would require systemic changes. It would require deciding that you're going to walk to work versus biking. Of the 60 actions that were assessed in the 6th assessment report, on an individual level, the biggest contribution comes from switching to biking and cycling and using electrified transportation. Other effective options include reducing air travel, adapting our houses. So that's why we have this adapting buildings, adapting our housing, shifting towards balanced plant-based diets is another option. To be effective, though, lifestyle changes will need to be supported by systemic changes across every aspect of society, including in buildings, in industry, land use, in the way in which cities are designed. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the transport sector, because the transport sector is also essential for reducing demand. And low carbon transport technologies are essential here. Electric vehicles offer the greatest potential as long as they are combined with low or zero carbon electricity sources. Advances in battery technologies, they could assist in electrification of trucks and complement conventional electric rail systems. But again, I really want to underscore the ability to simply reduce demand. So electric vehicles are great. There's a huge potential there. But if we reduce our demand and we, again, co-locate, have people live closer to where they work, or bring services closer to where people live so that people can walk to those services or ride bikes, that has a really substantial impact on lowering transport emissions. Now, we know that, so that's what we need to do. Those are the transitions that we need to do. We know that the next few years are critical if we want to limit global warming. And so we need to think about how we can improve our chances of success. And I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to start with finance. The IPCC report shows that financial flows are a factor of 3 to 6 times lower than the levels that are needed by 2030 to limit global warming. But the good news is there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close the investment gap. What we need is clear signaling from governments and the international community, including a much stronger alignment of the public sector finance and policy. And here I really want to highlight one of the questions, or not just one of the questions, many of the issues that were raised in the plenary. Remember, I said I felt like there was much more hope because countries wanted to know, what they could do and what they could do in finance. The challenge here of closing the finance gap is the biggest with regard to the global south. If we don't take into account the economic benefits of reduced adaptation costs or avoided climate impacts, global GDP would be just a few percentage points lower in 2050 if we take the actions necessary now to limit global warming to 2 degrees C or lower compared to current policies and business as usual. So in other words, we could save money in the long run if we just invested more wisely now. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about regulatory and economic instruments and policies, which are really crucial to strengthening the response. Now, regulatory and economic instruments, these range from standards for building efficiency and vehicle efficiency, building codes, all the way to policies for industrial decarbonization, to broad-based carbon taxes, emissions trading programs. These have been already proven to be very effective at reducing emissions. These measures can be, and they absolutely need to be strengthened and again, expanded significantly. So I feel like a little bit of a broken record now. We need to upscale and accelerate implementation. So just to repeat, we have a number of instruments in place, regulatory and economic instruments. They've been proven to be effective at reducing emissions. We need to upscale them. We need to expand them. We need to accelerate their implementation. Policy packages, the other thing is that policy packages a number of policies together, and economic-wide packages are much better able to achieve the systemic changes that we need in cities, in industry, in energy systems, than individual policy instruments. So let me just give you an example. If we think about cities, we can think about cities as the individual parts of cities, like building codes, making cars more efficient, making building codes so that buildings are more energy efficient. Those are individual policy instruments. But if we were to design cities from the very outset so that you don't have to use your car as much, you can walk or bike or use electrified transport to work, that actually has a much more systemic impact than individual policies. Ambitious and effective mitigation is going to require much more coordination across government, across government, the private sector, the public sector. It's going to require building consensus among very, very different stakeholders, from the very local, like even at the very local, at the city level, to regional, to the nation state. And these kinds of efforts of building, coordinating across different bodies, they've already been proven to be very effective. If we look at things like how coordination has occurred with civil society, indigenous peoples, professional bodies, and businesses. So we have lots of examples where coordination across different stakeholders can be much more effective. Now, in recent years, there's been enormous activity and a lot of progress in technology and innovation. Investments and policies, especially with regard to scientific training, as well as research and development, these really push forward low emissions technological innovation. The key, though, to effective decision-making is to be able to assess all the potential risks and benefits of different technologies and approaches, and understanding their implementation at scale. Again, I'm really emphasizing implementation at scale, and also identify what are the obstacles that stand in their way to large-scale implementation. Some options are technologically or technically, they're viable, they're cost-effective, and they're generally supported by the public. These need to be deployed at scale. Examples of these would be solar energy, energy efficient appliances, improving soil management, improving forest management, reforestation, reducing food waste. But there are other obstacles there are other options that face barriers that need to be addressed. And we need to better understand what the trade-offs are before they're implemented at scale. So in other words, we have a number of options that have been proven to work. They're currently not implemented at scale. We need to accelerate the implementation of these proven technologies at scale. These other technologies that are newer or new, we need to figure out what their trade-offs are, what their risks are, both to the public, to the environment. And I want to also underscore that adoption of low emissions technologies is slower in most developing countries, especially the least developing ones, due to limited financial capacities. So there's a big investment gap. The technology gap is rapidly closing, but still, one of the big gaps is really around investments in finance. I want to end with this very positive and optimistic note. We right now have an unprecedented opportunity and yet a challenge to shape the future of cities. And not just the future of cities, it's the future of the climate. 60% of the urban areas that are projected to be urban in 2050 have yet to be built. So if we look into the future, those 20,000 American football fields that get urbanized every single day, we need to accelerate the use of science-based strategy to design and build these new cities of tomorrow so that they are low carbon and that they contribute to the solutions to keeping climate change at 1.5 degrees or lower. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cito. Well, we have about 32 questions in the Q&A right now. And I have to say to the audience, you all are fantastic. I've enjoyed watching the conversation in the chat. It is depthful and intense. I'm not going to be addressing any questions that were posted in the chat because I have 32 in the Q&A box. So if you want a question considered, please do post it in the Q&A box, not in the chat. And I also want to say to Karen, while I pick what our first question is going to be, why don't you hold up a copy of your book again? Because many of the copies that were available on Amazon are sold now. So if you want to get one and you want it to be new, I suggest that you go to Amazon while we're talking. And please do feel free to email us at alumniacademy@yale.edu if you would like to get a signed book plate for your book after you purchase it. Karen has generously offered to sign books. And last but not least, shout out to everyone who is attending from COP27, because we have a couple of folks who are at COP27 in Cairo right now. Okay, I want to go to Stephanie's question. Hi, Stephanie, nice to see you again. Stephanie asks, is there data yet on reductions in emissions over the pandemic years? So, and references that one of the challenges we have is densifying while maintaining the tree canopy. Is densification the priority so that we can restore habitat?
Yeah, yes, and yes. If we, my view on this is, my view is really a global view and really looking into the future. If we are going to add 2.5 billion more people in cities and towns globally, we absolutely must design and build these cities so that they're more efficient, they're more walkable, so that we can save land for nature, so that we can save land so that land can do other functions such as storing and sequestering carbon, providing wildlife habitat, providing food. And we actually are quite inefficient with how we're designing and building most of the cities today. So that seems to be one low-hanging fruit. We know how to design and build cities. Again, this is an example where we have the science, and I know there are a number of folks on the call who are planners and designers and architects. We have the science. We know how to build and design cities so that they are low carbon, so that they are walkable and more human friendly, and so that they save land. It's a matter of upscaling this. But I also want to underscore, a lot of this is also around finance, and also it's around education. The American model of single family homes, low density single family homes, we've exported that as one of our big exports of the 20th century.
Okay, I want to go to a couple of technical questions, and I think Richard asked a really important question. What was the peak human population upon which the IPCC estimations for 2050 and beyond were based? Was it 8 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion?
I'd have to go back and look exactly at what the numbers were. And where the IPCC is taking the numbers from the UN estimates. So I think the most recent ones are a population of about 9 billion people. But again, I'd have to go back and take a look. Yeah.
Okay, and Nicholas also wants to know, is nuclear power considered in the 6th report? That was something also echoed by William, who was curious about nuclear power because it's a utility scale generator of electrical energy and emits essentially no CO2, says William.
Yeah, so all energy sources are assessed in the sixth assessment report. Every single types of pretty much large scale, all large scale energy types are assessed in the report.
Okay, and then I want to go to Richard's question. So there were a few sort of technical questions in the beginning about the first half of your presentation. Richard said, what is known of CO2 and methane levels at the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum? How did it happen that they declined?
So I am not the person to be asking about paleoclimate. We have lots of other faculty on campus who are paleoclimatologists. I think there was a question about the pandemic, and I think it might be worth just to spend a little moment to talk a little bit about that, because emissions did drop briefly during the pandemic, during the first few months of the pandemic, during the lockdown, but very quickly emissions went back up, and and they went back up almost across all sectors, not at the same rate, but it was really a small blip. And one of the questions now going forward is really, we're not really at post-pandemic, but there's a big question about how recovery from the pandemic may actually possibly accelerate emissions, and how, if there's an economic slowdown, what that might mean for the commitment of governments and the private sector to invest in low carbon and net zero carbon industries and technologies.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that you make, because during the pandemic, at the beginning at least, there was this moment where I think from Delhi, you could see the Himalayas for the first time in, decades. And there was this realization that, oh, we can do it. It just comes at a huge cost. And the economic factors were, I think, what people pointed to. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to say, I think that's probably one of the big messages from this report, is that we can do it. We have the technology. We know it's not like as though this is technology that's, not been tested. A lot of the strategies are actually low tech strategies. It's about being more efficient. It is about minimizing our waste. Minimizing our waste, all from production to consumption as consumers. And I think one of the really exciting things and new things about this report is also highlighting what we can do as individuals. And a lot of the report in the past has focused on large scale changes in the energy sector, right? Large scale changes in the transport sector, making electric vehicles, right? Decarbonizing the energy grid. But this report shines a special light on what we can do as individuals, all the choices that we make throughout the day, throughout the year. And I think it's also important to highlight that the report is, and the science is not saying, we all have to live lives, aesthetic lives. That's not the idea. But it is reevaluating where we can significantly reduce, and it really goes back to the reduce, reuse, recycle, minimizing our waste, and really having a closed loop in the economy. That's really essential.
I want to go to Victoria's question, because I think it gets to a little bit of what you're talking about, but on the scale of community actions that people can take. And Victoria says she's appointed chair of her small town's rewrite of all building design and code, and wonders if there's a model for small towns, looking at material specifications and things like that. Is there something that people can refer to if they want to work on making their town a model in this regard?
Well, Victoria, I wonder what small town she's from. I don't know if she said. So what the IPCC report does is it lays out what the science is and what the different options are. In terms of building codes, it doesn't go into, these are what the building codes are, but it seems like this would be a great opportunity for people like Victoria from a small town to work with scientists and look at the report, to translate the science of the report into specific building codes that are specific to her town, her small town. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of probably a gap from what the IPCC assesses versus what can be done in practice. We lay out in the report all the different technologies and strategies, but then it would be up to Victoria and her town to say, in my town of, let's say, for example, Carmel, these are the things that would be applicable in Carmel, because maybe Carmel is primarily single family detached homes versus a small town in India might be primarily multi-family, 5-story walk-ups, right? So the building codes will look very different for these kinds of towns. And again, a town that's in a coastal area versus a town in an arid area would be very different. But the science is there already. It's a matter of taking the science and then making the building codes based on what has been assessed.
And Aaron follows this up with a question on low carbon cities. Are there any examples that you would point to?
There are a number of examples of cities that are making great strides towards low carbon. I actually just published an article. We could send it out. I'm not going to try to pull it up on the screen right now, but there are examples in Australia, in China, in Africa, where they've made commitments to achieving net zero, and they've done it by doing a number of different things. One is by dramatically changing their transportation. So trackless trams, if those of you haven't heard of trackless trams, you can Google that, trackless trams. So this is, so trackless trams are a public transportation. They're basically like a tram, but trackless. So they're much more flexible in terms of the routes that they take. They don't require a track system, so that's pretty good. They run on electricity. The one in Australia, there's one in a couple in China are running on low carbon electricity. So it's a combination of transforming their transportation system, but also going back to densifying, selectively densifying. Basically densifying by bringing people closer to where jobs are, where commerce is, or bringing more housing where jobs are. So either bring jobs to people where they live or bring people closer to their jobs. Those have been two of the biggest strategies that cities have taken. But the other key strategy that cities need to take if they want to try to achieve net zero is also by improving their green infrastructure. So green infrastructure, either by way of planting trees, so planting more street trees, but also it's a matter of protecting or restoring the natural areas that they already have. So lots of cities have natural areas. And these natural areas, I'm not talking about street trees. I'm talking about in natural areas like wetlands, grasslands, well, not that many grasslands in North American cities, but wetlands, they could be urban forests. A number of these have to be protected. They have to be protected by from development so that they can reach their potential to sequester carbon, also provide a lot of different benefits to cool the city. So part of what cities need to do is protect the natural assets that they already have. But I did want to say the strategies to reach net zero, for cities to reach net zero, will really differ depending on the economic base of the city. So if the city is primarily a manufacturing city, it's going to have to focus a lot more on decarbonizing its industrial systems versus a city that's a service city. And also cities that have already been established where the infrastructure has already been built, the strategies there will be very different. It will be, again, about densifying versus emerging cities in the global south. It will be primarily about having low carbon design, because a lot of these cities haven't been designed, they haven't been built yet.
I know a couple of questions that have come in about how people can move the needle as an individual, making lifestyle changes, making philanthropic contributions, making investments. Eric asked about biking and electric cars as a personal action or changing one's diet. What are some of the best things to do?
Well, the number one thing that you can do so in the report, we assessed 60 different actions that individuals could do and what those actions would, what their impacts would be on emissions. The number one biggest contribution or biggest impact on lowering emissions would be to switch from fossil fuel cars to walking or cycling or using electric vehicles or electrified buses. So whoever was asking that question, if you are able to switch to that, that would be pretty significant. The other is that, there's a lot of our laws in place that prevent us from doing the right thing. So just as an example, we had a discussion here at Yale and New Haven a couple of months ago where a number of presenters, we talked about how cities need to be denser, where they need to be more fostering walking and biking. And one of the persons in the audience was a planner and saying, well, a lot of the cities in the US, the code for how wide the cities are, the width of cities is decided by the size of the fire truck, because the fire trucks need to be able to make a turn in the street. So that to me is not an insurmountable obstacle, right? We need to redesign the fire truck, not make our streets wider for the fire truck, right? That seems to be a pretty easy, relatively easy fix. But yes, anyway, sorry. So going back to the question, the number one thing you could do is being able to bike or walk. That would be pretty significant. Another thing is it seems like little things, but even lowering your thermostat just by 1 degree makes a really big difference. That is one example. Another example, there's a lot of discussions about making buildings more smarter and making buildings more efficient. I think that the report also highlights a number of actions we can take as individuals. We don't always have to be in a hermetically sealed building, right? If it's not too hot or too cold, you can actually just open the window. There are a lot of other strategies we can take as individuals. Obviously, we're not going to solve climate change by everybody opening up the window and not using air conditioning. But if you want to make a difference on an individual level, my point is that having a more plant-based, balanced diet would move the needle. Walking would move the needle. Assessing whether you need to turn on the air conditioning or the heater or whether you put on a sweater would move the needle. And it's not just each of us. It's not just each of us as individuals. If we think about scaling this up, would be pretty significant. Another thing that I think would really make a really big difference is in American cities right now. Many American cities are designed around single-family detached homes. And I know the state of California just recently passed a law that enables the development of an additional dwelling unit. Minneapolis just outlawed single-use zoning, right? There are a number of things that we can do that also would move the needle. And I think that one of the big opportunities for us as individuals is how do we spread the word and to look and see what are the different entry points where we can make a difference. So one other point that was raised, I think, Lauren, the question was something about like charitable giving. I think that there are a number, I don't even want to start listing them, but there are so many different organizations that are trying to move the needle by bringing technologies to the global South. And so this is my personal opinion about where we could move the needle with respect to charitable giving. I think if you look at the data, the biggest finance gap is in the global south. And so if we were able to finance the transition to net zero energy in the global south, that would make a really, really big impact. I don't know if I made clear. I mean, all the data that I've showed, and these emission, the data that I showed right now in terms of where we are at emissions, the fact that cities are generating like 2/3 of our emissions, those are from cities that have already been built. The emissions are from the industrial process now. It does not take into consideration the additional 3 billion people we're adding to the planet, the rapidly urbanizing and industrializing global south. And so either we can be a low carbon leader, transition and be a low carbon leader, or we need to enable the global south to leapfrog to pursue a more low carbon future themselves.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised that, because it does touch on a couple of questions, and I think an interesting point, which is that when you look at the data on population growth over the next 100 years, I think was just released in the past couple of months, it shows that the African continent has the largest population growth predicted, and is one of the few places in the world where negative population growth is not predicted. And yet we don't have real good solutions to how we transfer these models to other countries that are not sort of first world countries. And that was one of the questions that was asked was, what are your thoughts on how the IPCC data translates into developing countries?
That is a really good question. And that's something that we take a lot of consideration of, because the IPCC authors are comprised of scientists from the global north and the global south. So the chapter that I led in this assessment, about half of the authors were from the global south, from Africa, from South America, India. And so one of the things that we're constantly asking and assessing is, how applicable is this in the global south? For the urban chapter, we had an explicit discussion and assessment of what can be done in cities that have already been built versus the cities that haven't even been planned yet. Same thing with energy, same thing with transportation. So it's not just about high technology, high finance. And we do, the assessment does look at a number of different strategies. I just want to underscore again, so much of what can be done is low technology. So if we were, the earlier question about walking or biking, it wouldn't take a lot to simply paint a bike lane. We could get fancy and build a dedicated elevated bike lane like they have in Copenhagen and other parts of Europe, but it wouldn't take that much, it wouldn't be that expensive to literally paint a bike lane, to widen sidewalks. Bike lanes have been shown to encourage more biking. And we need to also look at the buildings that have already been built instead of building additional new buildings. We need to really protect the natural areas that we already have. So there's, again, just so much that we can do that isn't high cost. It's about, it's literally looking at the resources and assets that we have and saying, how can we protect these natural areas that are currently feeding us and sequestering carbon? How do we protect them from being developed with urban sprawl? How do we take the buildings that have already been built and either convert them to be more energy efficient or redesign them rather than building more? I think that's another big question.
Well, and I think it also points to the importance of local action, local civic involvement and the advocacy that individual people can do in their own communities. And even things like, many cities will come out and plant a tree in front of your house if you ask for it. I know they had that when I lived in Harlem, and I know there's an initiative actually from Yale School of the Environment to do that in certain neighborhoods in New Haven.
All
So,
neighborhoods in New Haven. So the Urban Resources Initiative, anybody in the city of New Haven, you don't have to be a homeowner, you can be a renter. You call URI or you go on their website and you request a street tree. The only request is that if you request a street tree, that you make a commitment to water and care for the tree for a little while before it gets started. That's pretty important. Yeah.
well, and people can support the work of the Yale School of the Environment. That's something else that you can do. And you're doing that by showing up here today. So thank you all for a really vibrant conversation. And we're going to keep it going because I still have, I think, 40 unanswered
Oh
questions
dear.
here.
Okay. I haven't looked at these. Yeah.
So yeah, that's all right. Quite a few people asking about nuclear power. Do you imagine a role for nuclear power short, mid, or long term as solar and wind technologies expand in scale?
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, this is where I think this is an ethical question. I mean, climate change is actually it's a normative issue of like, are we putting all the burden on the next generation? It's an ethical question. Do we deal with it now? And I think that my own opinion is that nuclear power is likely to be part of the solution going forward. There are, obviously there are risks associated with nuclear power. There are risks associated with coal, right? It depends on how we're thinking about these risks. Short-term risks that are catastrophic, but maybe the impacts are catastrophic, but the likelihood of happening are very, very low, versus risks that are, or impacts that are maybe not as catastrophic, but happen all the time. I think we need to start thinking about risks in terms of generational impacts as well. Lots of different things to think about. I mean, I think when the public had the conversation, or not that the public had one conversation about nuclear power, but I think a lot of the discussions about nuclear power were around the risks associated with malfunctioning of a power plant. And obviously that's a catastrophic impact and a big risk. And it's also very, it's a question of, where do you cite this? It's a justice issue of where do you actually put this kind of a power plant? Make no bones about it. Climate change is also a justice issue. I mean, not everybody is affected equally by climate change. And right now, what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions and climate changes, we're affecting the entire planet, right? And so I think it is a question of, are there ways and places where we could cite certain types of industries, certain types of energy to minimize the risk that would be more equitable? That is a really big question. I think very similar questions with regard to CDR, carbon dioxide removal. Some of these have low risk. Reforestation has no risk or low risk. Soil management, we know those to be very effective. But there are a number of other CDR technologies that are not tested. A lot of trade-offs potentially with health, with a lot of other uncertainties. So solar radiation management is one of them. That's being proposed. So there's been some experiments around that. Yeah, everything is going to have risks and trade-offs. I think here's the thing that I think is one challenge right now, is that we are having these discussions, or we're not having these discussions, but climate change and emissions continue to increase. So we don't have the luxury of saying, well, let's wait until we know the perfect solution. my colleague in the School of the Environment, Pete Raymond, he gave a presentation recently, and it was so so heartening to see him give this presentation. He showed the emissions graph from the last 100 years, and he said, so he and I are about the same age, and he said, when I was graduating, finishing my PhD nearly 25 years ago, it seemed like we had so much time to shift that curve. And now we're saying we need to have peak emissions in 3 years, and we need to bend that curve in the next 10 years. So I'm saying that because, sure, nuclear power is not going to be perfect. CDR is not going to be perfect. And maybe some people don't want to live in a city. And maybe, there are a lot of different trade-offs, but we don't have the luxury to say, let's wait for the perfect solution. That's the thing that we're faced with now. We don't have the luxury for, the all best perfect solution. There's no such thing.
I think it's a really good point, because it's not something that people commonly make. That hey, we might need to just start throwing everything up against the wall at this point.
Yeah. The big challenge really is finance, right? It's finance, and that's why I ended one of my slides with, we need to upscale and accelerate implementation. If we were to take all the technologies that currently exist that we know to have an impact on reducing emissions, including behavior shift, we could move the needle. And that's the good news. It's not like we're waiting for some dreamy, sci-fi technology transformation to come from outer space. It is among us.
Okay, well, lots of questions about the technology. So I want to go to Salil. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. What are your thoughts on carbon capture technology, if it's feasible at scale, and the potential controversy around hydrogen replacing fossil fuels?
Yeah. So CDR. So as I said, CDR.
Sorry, wait. While you're on CDR, there was one more on. Okay. Since you're going to reference it, on biochar. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Okay. So CDR. Let me just say briefly. So CDR. I only talked about this very, very briefly. So CDR is a family of strategies, and it basically refers to removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And there are a number of different CDR techniques. So one technique is bioenergy. It's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So this is something that you might have heard of, called BECCS. What BECCS is, so this is bioenergy with CCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. What this is, it's the process of extracting bioenergy. So it's extracting bioenergy from vegetation, from biomass, right? So you grow corn, as an example, and you extract biomass. And you extract biomass, and you, by converting the biomass into bioenergy, you're basically capturing and storing the carbon, and therefore you're removing it from the atmosphere. So you might want to know, like, well, where's the carbon in the biomass coming from? Well, it comes from CO2, which is then extracted by plants. It's extracted by plants as they grow. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking plants that extract CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow, they convert it into biomass. We take that biomass and we extract bioenergy from the biomass. And then we take that biomass and we extract energy in the form of, let's say, convert it into electricity. So the biomass is utilized through, let's say, combustion, fermentation, a number of other conversion methods. Some of the carbon in the biomass can be converted to CO2. And this can then, the CO2 can then be stored by some kind of geologic sequestration. So literally sequestering the CO2 in rocks, or using some kind of land application, such as, for example, with reforestation or soil management. Another kind of CDR is direct air carbon capture and storage. So where BECCS is about producing, right, taking from on the production end, taking the biomass, converting, extracting the bioenergy. DAX is about consuming. So direct air carbon capture with carbon storage, that is a technology that uses a chemical process. It takes a chemical process to capture and separate CO2 directly from the air. So it's a very, very different process. The CO2 that's separated, captured and then separated, it can then be injected into rocks or underground to make, or they can be used to make long-lasting products or products in general. So you might have seen something called carbon valorization. So that's the idea where you're taking CO2 from the atmosphere, you separate it into their component parts, and then you make something useful out of it. There have been products like a number of different products. Alcohol as one. Anyway, it's a cottage industry now to take CO2 from the atmosphere and then to make some kind of product. The thing there is that the chemicals are used to capture more CO2. Both of these take quite a bit of energy. Obviously, BECCS takes a lot of energy in terms of combustion, fermentation. And I think this is something else that we need to look at the trade-offs of, is the technologies and the energy that's required to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. This is why I am in favor of low cost and not just low cost, but strategies that that we know to work to have fewer trade-offs in terms of costs or health or otherwise.
Okay, I think that's a really helpful clarification that you've made, sort of on where you stand on the issue. I want to sort of bring us to a close with just a couple of people asking about the government societal cooperation aspect of this. And I'm going to give you a few points and then just let you sort of comment as you see fit. David says it seems pretty clear that limiting warming to 2 degrees or less is technically achievable, but it requires societal change.
Yeah.
And it's really a societal, political, psychological change. Is there research or innovation on how we address this aspect? Yeah. And other people are sort of asking, what do you think about, how do you feel about the COP27 conference? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I say that because David's question, he says, COP seems to be the main mechanism for coordinating global action. And it's not clear whether or not that process is enough.
So I don't know, I can't remember who asked that question. It is not enough. My opinion is it cannot be the only avenue. And I think, again, going back to this report where we are, the IPCC for the first time is looking at what individuals can do. So for so many years, we've been looking at nation states. And yes, nation states, governments, institutions at the national and international level have to enable the systemic changes at the local level. I may want to walk to work, but if my city is zoned such that I live here and I work there, I'm not going to be able to walk to work, right? I may want to have an electric vehicle that is powered by net zero electricity, but if the government is not incentivizing private industry to generate or develop net zero energy, I can't use my EV with net zero electricity, right? So there are systemic things, but there are so many other things that we can do as individuals every day when we spend money, right? We're basically voting for making, we're making choices about what we value, and we're sending a signal to the private sector and to the public sector. You know, at this event that we had in New Haven at Yale a couple of months ago, the mayor of New Haven showed up. And it was so wonderful because we engaged in a conversation with the mayor about making cities more walkable, net zero. And the mayor said, you know, I don't have people pounding in my office wanting bike lanes. What I do have are developers coming and wanting to develop this, this, and this. And so we as individuals absolutely need to take much more of a role in being part of the change that we want to see. Part of that is by voting. Part of that is through, maybe it's with, you know, over the Thanksgiving dinner table. Maybe it's, you know, maybe it's having conversations with friends, family, and neighbors, and having a discussion of what you can do at the neighborhood scale. Maybe, you know, installing bioswales. Maybe it's, you know, tree planting. Again, just like I said, opening the window isn't going to solve climate change. My point is that we need to absolutely pivot and move from just expecting or hoping that the state is going to do the right thing. And my point is that there's so much that we can do as individuals, as communities of individuals.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Professor Cito. The book is City Unseen, and there are only a few copies of it left on Amazon because you all bought them all while we were talking. City Unseen, New Visions of an Urban Planet. If you happen not to be able to find one on Amazon using the link that I've posted in the chat, please do email us at alumniacademy@yale.edu and we will find you a copy. Thank you, Professor Cito. We still have 32 unanswered questions. You've generated quite a lively debate today, and a wonderful, resounding closing to our climate change conversation series in partnership with Yale School of the Environment. I hope that we can have you back again in the future for another talk. And I look forward to seeing all of you in our next webinar series. And until then, bye-bye, everyone.